Welcome to the Chapter 3 Stigma podcast. This podcast was created to be there for any individual who feels that they are at a low point in life and are confused, seemingly alone, and helpless in their situation. I am a recovering alcoholic, and I felt this way too, until I sat across a table from another addict who shared his story and made me realize that I was not alone in my struggles. My life was saved by this realization, and I hope to help anyone struggling by sharing my story to show you that you are not alone and that life can contain unbelievable riches and meaning. Welcome. I am glad you are here. Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Chapter 3 Stigma podcast. In today's episode, we are going to be progressing through Dr. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and staying in the first section of the book titled The Experiences from a Concentration Camp. So in today's episode, we are going to be broadly speaking about the theme of suffering and his experience and observations there, and then I'll extract myself from the work as we go through it, just to overlay my own personal experiences, learnings, how I perceived the work again before I entered into recovery, and then after. Through the lens of really what we were going through with Lucy and her health condition and as a family. So getting to the book. The attempt to develop a sense of humor and to see things in a humorous light is some kind of a trick learned while mastering the art of living. Yet it is possible to practice the art of living even in a concentration camp, although suffering is omnipresent. To draw an analogy, a man's suffering is similar to the behavior of gas. If a certain quantity of gas is pumped into an empty chamber, it will fill the chamber completely and evenly, no matter how big the chamber. Thus, suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative. Coming out of the book here, after that first paragraph. So for me, I always struggled, I struggled the first time reading through this and really recognizing and understanding that when I was drinking, when I was suffering with my alcoholism, that I knew it was relative. And like this was something that really ate at me. I reflected on my life. I reflected on my upbringing. I could look around and recognize that I had a lot to be grateful for, and it drove me insane realizing that I was suffering, and to recognize that it didn't feel like I could handle a significant amount of suffering. One of the biggest fears that I had in my time drinking, especially in the last 2.5 years, when I was lying, manipulating, and really hiding my drinking, was this: the fear that something real and something meaningful and impactful would require me to rise up to a level of functionality and like requirements of a human, of a man that I couldn't do. I was so scared that life would call upon me in a manner that I couldn't rise. And I will be honest, in reading through and preparing for this podcast episode, I didn't really know how to think about the analogy that he gives about a chamber being completely filled with gas, regardless of the volume of gas actually injected. And I was kind of thinking about it in terms of the ability to handle, varying amounts of suffering. And finally, one aspect that made me click, because really I knew and recognized that the amount of suffering that we went through with Lucy was more and was greater than what I went through before entering into recovery, that I went through with my alcoholism. Yet something was different. Something was different about my experience, more so than just the volume of the volume of gas, which is analogous to the amount of suffering injected into like this vessel. And it finally clicked for me, and I realized that what had changed, again, pertaining to this analogy, was actually the mechanical design and the mechanical properties of my vessel, of my, I guess, call it suffering vessel. In entering into recovery, I built out the capability within me to handle more pressure, to handle more and greater suffering, which came into fruition and got put through the test with Lucy and her story. And the way you can think about it is, there are specific properties to building a gas-containing vessel. So like if you're driving around, so I started my career in oil and gas refining, and anything that is a high-pressure gas, that contains high-pressure gas, is going to have some sort of spherical design and build to it. And there are other mechanical properties like the thickness of the metal, the type of fasteners or welding that is conducted to bring that form together. There are very specific mechanical properties that makes it able to contain and hold higher pressures. Again, higher pressures in this analogy detailing higher amounts of suffering or greater suffering. And then I started to think about, well, what changed between my time before entering recovery and after, such that my vessel had these mechanical changes to it. And I really brought it back to this. The things that change the properties of your suffering vessel are this: faith, purpose, love, the way you talk to yourself, and your default mode of thinking. And for me, that really spoke to like gratitude. So how you view the lens through which you view the world kind of in a default mode. Something happens to you, how do you react to it? What is your thought process that cascades through your mind upon the immediate moments after the event occurring? So for me, this was all very deliberate and learned processes through exercises, through journaling, through gratitude practice that actually slowly over time built up the robustness of the mechanical properties of my vessel that contains and holds my suffering. I am just one note before getting back into the work. So I obviously alluded to working at the refinery. I am a mechanical engineer by degree, specializing in fluids. And so this analogy just like really works for me. And again, that aspect of the mechanical property changes to the actual vessel makes a lot of sense to me in terms of seeing someone who is seemingly capable of handling more suffering than myself. And you shouldn't draw these comparisons. It's not overly healthy to draw these comparisons, but it does help connect with the idea that, hey, I'm capable of more. And that's a lot of what I got out of this reading that we'll get into here. So we'll keep going and we'll hit on that as it comes up. So back to the book. It also follows that a very trifling thing can cause the greatest of joys. Take as an example something that happened on our journey from Auschwitz to the camp affiliated with Dachau. We had all been afraid that our transport was heading for the Mauthausen camp. We began more and more tense as we approached a certain bridge over the Danube, which the train would have to cross to reach Mauthausen. According to the statement of experienced traveling companions, those who have never seen anything similar cannot possibly imagine the dance of joy performed in the carriage by the prisoners when they saw that our transport was not crossing the bridge, and was instead heading, quote, only for Dachau. And again, what happened on our arrival in that camp after a journey lasting 2 days and 3 nights, there had not been enough room for everybody to crouch on the floor of the carriage at the same time. The majority of us had to stand all the way, while a few took turns at squatting on the scanty straw, which was soaked with human urine. When we arrived, the first important news that we heard from old prisoners was that this comparatively small camp, its population was 2,500, had no, quote, oven, no crematorium, no gas. That meant that a person who had become a Muslim could not be taken straight to the gas chamber, but would have to wait until a so-called sick convoy had been arranged to return to Auschwitz. This joyful surprise put us all in a good mood. The wish of the senior warden of our hut in Auschwitz had come true. We had come as quickly as possible to a camp which did not have a, quote, chimney, unlike Auschwitz. We laughed and cracked jokes in spite of and during all we had to go through in the next few hours. When we knew arrivals were counted, one of us was missing. So we had to wait outside in the rain and cold wind until the missing man was found. He was at last discovered in a hut where he had fallen asleep from exhaustion. Then the roll call was turned into a punishment parade. All through the night and late into the next morning, we had to stand outside, frozen and soaked to the skin after the strain of our long journey, and yet we were all very pleased. There was no chimney in this camp, and Auschwitz was a long way off. And coming out of the book here, it is overly impossible for me to even compare any experience that I've had against which was just read and just detailed there. The only thing that I want to highlight is tying this back to the opening of this section about the attempt to develop a sense of humor and just living in a manner in which somehow, some way, despite the intense amount of suffering, there are still those moments of joy and moments of humor that play a stark contrast to the bleakness and the surroundings that might encompass you while suffering, but nonetheless, I guess for me, indicate that there is and there was still life remaining within you, and still life worth pushing for, and striving for. One of the hardest aspects of connecting with and understanding that I had really felt like I had become lost in my battle with alcoholism was the loss of joy and humor in my life. There were numerous instances where I would recognize something as a situation or a comment or a joke where I would have laughed in the past, and I found nothing. I felt nothing. Those were frightful moments for me. And, in reading this account and reading this kind of story, really what it made me realize was that I had lost something. I had hit some point of, maybe it was apathy, as we covered in the last podcast episode, but it just made me recognize that truly something was wrong if I was not even able to find a slight bit of humor in a situation where I would have found humor or joy in the past. That was just a massive, massive signal to me. One final comment on the topic of humor and joy, on possibly, I don't know if we can rank them, but on one of the hardest days of Alyssa and my journey, in my whole family's journey, in the time since losing Lucy was the day after, leaving the hospital empty, getting injected back into the world that seemingly didn't care, knew nothing, kept turning, and just the extreme change from that hospital environment and pushing for and feeling that small sense of hope every day to falling into and sinking into your reality. We had a beautiful moment with our entire extended family. Alyssa and her parents, her brother and our sister-in-law, my whole family, my parents, my two sisters, brother-in-law, all gathered around the table at lunch the day after we lost Lucy. And all of us not really knowing what to do, not really knowing what to say, and suddenly finding ourselves laughing genuinely at the place where the conversation just sort of naturally flowed. And, Alyssa and I recognized at one point during that lunch at really how exhausted we were. And so we excused ourselves and we retreated downstairs, and we took a moment down there and we paused and we looked at each other, and we just recognized and commented how good it felt to laugh, and how good it felt to laugh with those that were seated around the table. That's a meaningful moment in our journey of grief in losing Lucy and healing from that. And it has been one that we've gone back to often, like to have that amount of laughter and joy with loved ones so close to us. It really helped in a big way set the course for our coming healing journey. So back to the book. I'm jumping ahead quite a bit, but we're going to stay on the topic of suffering in particular. So to the book. We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Even though conditions such as lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various mental stresses may suggest that the inmates were bound to react in certain ways, in the final analysis it became clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision, and not the result of camp influences alone. Fundamentally, therefore, any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him, mentally and spiritually. He may retain his human dignity even in a concentration camp. Dostoevsky said once, quote, "There is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." These words frequently come to my mind after I became acquainted with those martyrs whose behavior in camp, whose suffering and death bore witness to the fact that the last inner freedom cannot be lost. The way they bore their suffering was a genuine inner achievement. It is this spiritual freedom, which cannot be taken away, that makes life meaningful and purposeful. And I'm going to come out of the book here before reading the closing sections. Just a couple notes or comments that I had on that portion of the reading. Again, through the lens of the first time that I read through this section in particular, actually drove me, and it kept some amount of hope alive within me, because again, as it was said, really just one single instance of an individual, of a person behaving in this manner against the backdrop of the incredible and horrific amounts of suffering is sufficient proof that man in general is capable of this. I saw this reflected and found encouragement in this mindset when it came to recovery. I didn't call it really a search for recovery at that time, but all I could cling to in that moment is basically the premise that I know for a fact that a single individual who may have been in my situation before, even though I feel totally alone and lonely and isolated in this battle, I know that there are people that have what I was looking for at that time, taking control back in their lives. Now, I didn't recognize or realize that The control I was seeking was actually the acceptance of an inability or lack of control. But I knew that there was an instance of a single individual out there somewhere that had taken their lives back after maybe suffering through addiction, alcoholism, and battles such as that. So just that one instance of proof positive was sufficient and was something that I clung to. And finally, the note that I have, and really the experience that I gained after going through the loss of Lucy, really, when I read that part about the spiritual freedom that cannot be taken away, one of the greatest gifts, one of the greatest achievements, I guess, and maybe that upon reflection that might be the wrong choice of words, but I'll stick with it for right now. In all of Lucy's story was feeling no anger towards God. And the reason in particular that is such an impactful experience for me, to the point that it genuinely does feel like a gift, is just knowing how always present anger and rage was, especially leading up in my life, especially in the 12 years of battling alcoholism, and certainly in the last 2.5 years of my time battling alcoholism alone. Anger was always there. And then to have gone through the greatest challenge of my life with the most amount of suffering that I've ever taken on in my life, to genuinely feel no anger, no bitterness, no resentment against myself, against others, and against God is a miracle. Now back to the book. A creative life and a life of enjoyment are banned to him. But not only creativeness and enjoyment are meaningful. If there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. The way in which a man accepts his fate and all the suffering it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life. Here lies the chance for a man either to make use of or to forego the opportunities of attaining the moral values that a difficult situation may afford him. And this decides whether he is worthy of his sufferings or not. I knew in my fight, my lonely fight with alcoholism, that I was not worthy of the sufferings, or I did not feel worthy in the moments of the suffering that I was going through. In the months, and quite honestly, in the year after losing Lucy, I really took the approach and viewed life through the lens of fully requiring to find meaning in suffering. I fell back to genuinely believing that life is suffering, and finding meaning, finding purpose within that suffering was your highest calling. This passage plays out the holistic picture perfectly, because that constrained view of life purely and only being suffering is wrong. It's not accurate. It makes sense in the time period after having such a loss and going through so much of a burden with healing and finding that and seeking that new normal after losing a child. I feel like in reflecting back, it was a natural defensive mechanism for me to view life through only and purely this lens of suffering. But in reading this passage again and in connecting with the foundational premise of what constitutes meaning that Dr. Frankl is making a point around in this piece of work. Suffering is only a portion of it. Is suffering guaranteed in life? Yes. So is it worthwhile to understand and pursue finding and capturing meaning and purpose within the constraints and within the realm of suffering? Absolutely. That makes all the sense in the world. But to view life through the lens of it being purely and only suffering is wrong. And so there is this creative life. There is this pursuit of enjoyment. And when you have these blissful and beautiful moments that are largely free of suffering and filled with purpose, we should pause and we should recognize it and we should be grateful for it. So that's all I've got for this week. All my love. If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with others who might find it impactful. And give us a rating through your streaming platform of choice. Ratings and comments help spread the work to others who are desperately searching for a solution. This simple action could have profound impacts on the lives of others. My hope is that my story can help those who feel alone in their struggles with addiction or any other aspects of life. You can follow us on social media at Chapter 3 Stigma on Instagram and YouTube. If you want to reach out with a message through one of those channels, I will respond and let you know that you are not alone. All the best, you are loved, and know that this life is full of abundant joy and wonder and is worth every struggle and bit of suffering you must endure. Until next time.